Welcome, Alexa Koenig. It's a real pleasure to have you here today with us at the IAGS conference. Alexa is a lecturer in residence and executive director of the Human Rights Center School of Law of the University of California, Berkeley. And she will speak about gender, genocide, and the probative power of digital information. She's an expert really on technologies and how to use those in the context of human rights and mass atrocities. And I will just make the presentation short because I think the best presentation will be listening to her talking. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Alexa. Whenever you want, you can start.
Thank you, Elisenda, for that kind introduction. And thank you to you and Armin for the invitation to come and speak with everyone today. I'm incredibly honored to have this chance to talk a little bit about stuff that I'm very passionate about, namely the use of digital technologies in securing justice for genocide and other atrocity crimes. I do think that digital technologies are becoming increasingly important for understanding and securing the tools to get accountability for that penultimate crime in court. In 2016, the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law established its investigations lab to try to help bring about what are known as digital open source investigations and bring them into legal investigations of atrocity crimes, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. For anyone who's not already familiar with digital open source investigations, they're defined as investigations that rely on information that any member of the public can access on the internet through observation, through request, or through purchase. By observation, we just mean you go to a Google search browser and you type in the terms that you're looking for, or to some other kind of search browser. By request, we mean everything from making a Freedom of Information Act request of a government to release documents to making a request on some kind of website. And then purchase, because of course, information that we would see in news periodicals or academic periodicals sometimes do come with a relatively small fee. It would not include information that is prohibitively expensive to average members of the general public. It also doesn't include information where you're required to have some kind of special status, like be law enforcement, for example, issue a subpoena to get access to that online information. And it doesn't include information that you have to use some form of illegal activity to get, like hacking. So this lab that we created at the Human Rights Center at Berkeley was a giant experiment when we first tried it out in 2016. We had seen how journalists and intelligence operators were increasingly mining social media and other online spaces for information related to world events. But we had also seen very little of that information coming in any systematic way into legal and academic spaces in the same kinds of ways that we were seeing it used more generally for fact-finding and, of course, verification of that information. One of the most challenging things, of course, about mining information from online spaces is understanding the veracity of that content. Is a photo that claims to be from Myanmar in 2017, in fact, from Myanmar, or is it from some other very different time and place? I think the first thing that surprised me most when I began working with a lot of this digital information for legal investigations and for related investigations was just how often information was being circulated that actually was being recycled from very different contexts in very different ways, which of course lends to the distrust that many people have about digital information that can be found online. A lot of what the genesis of this had been was work that we had been doing with the International Criminal Court back in 2010, 2011. We were looking at the court's 10-year anniversary and realizing that many cases were falling apart at very early stages of prosecution. And the question that we were beginning to ask was why? We sent a PhD student to the court who embedded herself there for several months, and she looked through all the court filings and basically came back and said, look, the judges are saying that the prosecution team is over-relying on a couple of different kinds of information. One, NGO reports, which they're considering not evidence. Second, the testimony of survivors, but not bringing in the corroborating information that is needed to bring that testimony to some sort of legal standard to allow the cases to proceed. So the genesis of much of this was asking what kinds of other information is out there that can actually shore up what survivors are saying is happening in their communities to ensure that there can be some form of justice in court And of course, there are also the bigger overarching objectives of making sure that this information can contribute to the historical record and that there's a narrative upon which communities and the global community, in addition, can rely. So this lab was a giant experiment to see how we could begin to bring in some of these tools being used in very different contexts to help strengthen these evidentiary records. We were recognizing, as were many other legal investigators, lawyers, and scholars, that the world was experiencing a fundamental shift in how humans communicate, both about everyday phenomena like what they were eating for dinner to monumental world events like revolutions. We know, of course, that there's been the proliferation of the smartphone and the rise of social media over the last decade and a half. These seemed like very rich areas for beginning to articulate the social networks that ultimately you have to be able to draw in order to get some form of accountability. What better way to show the connection between people than to use the kinds of tools that were being developed to not only identify those networks, but to strengthen them. So we launched the lab in September 2016 to see, could we harness the diverse talents and abilities of a 55,000 person, very international campus, one that was hovering on the edge of Silicon Valley with tremendous digital capacity to conduct digital open source investigations and link that capacity to different groups of fact finders around the world. Ultimately, for those, these open source investigations rely on very different kinds of content online. Social media is perhaps the best known, but this also includes other forms of websites and information that can be found there, such as databases. It's amazing how often someone who's created a Google Sheet doesn't realize that their settings have been set to public, and that this is actually, that their spreadsheets and the data they've collected is actually quite public facing, and that anyone who knows how to look for that information can find it online. That's happened to us several times where we've stumbled across spreadsheets that we suspect people meant to have private, but had actually left leaking out in very public spaces. It includes satellite imagery that members of the public can access. It's usually lower quality, Google Earth type information, but ultimately is information that if it does come into courts can be supplemented with higher resolution imagery. It comes down to hobbyist sites such as including flight tracking and ship tracking records. There's an entire universe, of course, on the internet. Importantly, another thing I didn't realize when we started doing this work is that only 4% of what is accessible online is on the surface web. So the information that you can access by putting in a Google search or a search on another kind of search engine, that is basically the information that these companies have indexed as a portion of the internet. Far more, the remaining 96%, can be found on the deep and dark webs, but it's really important to know how to access the information found there in order to pull that information out for either academic or legal purposes. We had thought we would start the lab with maybe 10 students. When we posted the research opportunity online, however, the demand to participate proved so great that we had to force shut the floodgates at about 42. We forged a partnership with Amnesty International, who provided some of the initial training, but we also decided to help them start their digital verification core, of which we were the founding member. Under Sam Dubberly's leadership at Amnesty, the core is now a network of 7 universities spread across 5 continents. The idea is that they provide online open source investigation capacity to Amnesty researchers, and also the painstaking and often very time-consuming work of verifying that information. To verify that information, they're often taking these posts from social media and other online places and checking whether there's any technical data attached to that information that might help prove the who, where, when, what, and why of the context around a particular item. It also means that they're often trying to geolocate that particular video or photograph. So in other words, use a satellite image and compare it with the imagery to see if this really does seem to be the place that it claims to have been. And then finally, to check on the source, to use a lot of the same open source investigation tools to see if that source is reliable for the kinds of information that they're sharing. Let's see. The other big challenge, of course, with online open source information is that especially the most damning information, that which actually depicts the underlying acts, can be quite ephemeral. As many of you know, the terms of service of social media companies is such that a lot of the information that may depict acts of violence will be removed, and often quite quickly. So it's important to increasingly know where to find that information fast, how to capture it, how to preserve it to some kind of forensic standard if you do want it to have legal weight, but even if you're wanting to use it more for advocacy or academic purposes, how to know its trustworthiness and how to safeguard it in case you're later needing to use it to shore up the work that you're doing, and ultimately to know how much you can trust what you hear and what you see. Today, our team is approximately 60 students and 5 professional staff who conduct up to a dozen investigations at any time. The team collectively speaks close to 30 languages and represents approximately 24 disciplines, ranging from computer science to journalism to law to public health. We conduct these investigations and lead training on how to conduct these investigations for 3 sets of end users: human rights advocacy groups, investigative reporters and other journalists, and legal investigators, which is very broadly conceived. On the advocacy organization side, we've worked with everyone from Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Human Rights to smaller groups like the Syrian Archive and activist and grassroots human rights advocacy groups on the ground in sites of conflict. Investigative reporters and other journalists, we've worked with Reuters, the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, but also, of course, smaller media groups. And then in the legal investigator capacity, those usually have included United Nations Commissions of Inquiries, the International Criminal Court, Interpol, nonprofit law firms, et cetera. These open source investigations have proven especially valuable over the past year, while the world was facing a wave of internet shutdowns and a global pandemic that really restricted movement. For a lot of organizations, these remote investigations went from a nice to have to a need to have. The challenge, of course, is that while technology offers so many opportunities to understand these atrocities, they also come with significant limitations, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. To give you a taste of what is involved in an open source investigation, just in case you're not that familiar with them, I'd like to now show you a brief clip that summarizes work that an amazing team at the center, led by Stephanie Croft and Andrea Lampros, conducted for the Associated Press. This reflects one of our most recent investigations, in this case documenting events related to the February 2021 coup in Myanmar. While it's not genocide specific, the work we conducted here, I think, is very illustrative of what might be done to investigate allegations of genocide, and very much came from a previous investigation that I'll also speak about that was a genocide specific investigation. So I will now share my screen, and as always, cross my fingers that this actually works. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thanks.
More than 800 people have died in Myanmar since the military takeover in February. 17-year-old.
As an entrepreneur with big, bold, ambitious ideas,
apologize.
are you lacking
queued
clarity?
This up so there wouldn't be
The Flow
ads,
Research Collective is
snuck
holding
them in anyway.
Jamin Lat was one of them. His death is among a string of incidents where security forces have grabbed people off the streets, some never to be found again. The tactic has been used in other conflicts worldwide to create fear and anxiety among the population.
What is new is that this is taking place on the street and in public view. Normally, this kind of enforced disappearance takes place at night in the shadows without any public awareness of it.
Together with UC Berkeley's Human Rights Center Investigations Lab, the Associated Press analyzed photos, video, and social media posts and identified more than 130 cases where security forces have beaten, mutilated, or snatched bodies. Witnesses and family members have corroborated several of the accounts.
So this shows all of our incidents that we've identified.
Our initial collection was roughly 2,000 to 3,000 tweets over a span of about 2 months. And so from there, the challenge is just working through the large volume of posts.
So many people are retweeting and reposting the media that's originally circulated. And that in and of itself presents a lot of challenges when it comes to verifying the material, because there will be different claims of what's going on in the video based on who's posting it, based on when it was posted.
Among the posts circulating was the video of Jamin Lat.
What's really remarkable about this motorcycle incident that happened in Myanmar is that just how well documented it is from the beginning to the end.
Using satellite imagery, screen grabs of the footage, reverse image searches, and a sun shadow calculator, researchers verified the shooting took place in front of a high school in Dawei on March 27th. The incident begins at 10:38 a.m. with the sound of gunshots captured on CCTV. 16 minutes later, the first image surfaces on social media. The post mentions that a man was taken by the military and asks if anyone recognizes the bike. Within 2 hours, this CCTV footage is shared widely. The picture showed the same fence where Jamin Lat was shot while riding with 2 other men on a motorcycle. The bike is later left in the same position captured in the photos. When the teen's bodies returned to his family days later, the official death certificate states he died from falling off a motorcycle. Another photo posted by a local news outlet shows a large wound in the teen's neck. Human rights experts say the trove of videos and images from Myanmar could serve another purpose as well.
If individuals who are committing that crime can be identified, it puts them at great legal liability in terms of crimes against humanity.
While Jamin Lat's family was able to hold a funeral, the military has cremated or secretly buried an unknown number of bodies. After a 13-year-old boy was killed by a stray bullet, his family refused to turn him over to authorities. Instead, they hid the body and cremated him the next day. David Martin, The Associated Press.
Okay, I'll stop my share and get out of this. So in 2018, we began working with Steve Stecklow, who's a reporter for Reuters, on one of our first major investigations into the events that were taking place in Myanmar, in particular related to the then alleged genocide against the Rohingya population. That investigation really focused on and explored Facebook's role in fomenting hate that was contributing to the genocide against the Rohingya. As Steve noted in his publication in April 2018, and I'm quoting, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg told US senators that the social media site was hiring dozens more Burmese speakers to review hate speech posted in Myanmar. The situation was dire. Some 700,000 members of the Rohingya community had recently fled the country amid a military crackdown and ethnic violence. In March, United Nations investigators said Facebook was used to incite violence and hatred against the Muslim minority group. The platform, she said, had turned into a beast. Citing some examples of what was found on Facebook, one user had posted a restaurant advertisement featuring Rohingya-style food, saying, "We must fight them the way Hitler did the Jews, damn colors," the person wrote, using a pejorative term for the Rohingya. That post went up in December 2013. Another post showed a news article from an army-controlled publication about attacks on police stations by Rohingya militants. And then I'm quoting, "These non-human color dogs, the Bengalis, are killing and destroying our land, our water, and our ethnic people," the user wrote. "We need to destroy their race." That post went up last September as the violence against the Rohingya peaked. And then a third user shared a blog item that pictures a boatload of Rohingya refugees landing in Indonesia. "Pour fuel and set fire so that they can meet Allah faster," a commenter wrote. The post appeared 11 days after Zuckerberg's Senate testimony, essentially claiming that they had scrubbed Facebook of these kinds of posts. Ultimately, Facebook had denied that hate speech against the Rohingya still existed on their platform, but our team found more than 1,000 examples that ultimately proved that that was incorrect. Steve's series at Reuters went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, but most importantly, it brought critical attention to both the negative and the positive potential of social media to exacerbate and to account for atrocities. As we all know, genocide is one of the most difficult crimes to prosecute. First, there must be the political will to do so. When political will is absent, it ultimately falls on survivors, on the media, academics, and advocates to build that will by informing the world about what is happening and motivating the world to act. Very often, the information that's being pulled together is coming from social media and being shared across social media. Of course, those stories are never as powerful as when it's those most affected who are doing the talking. And that is where social media, of course, can sometimes allow a very direct form of communication between people who are experiencing severe suffering and the rest of the world. Once that will is generated, of course, then prosecutors face a steep uphill slope to establish with sufficient evidence the crime's actus reus, the physical acts that are required. According to the Rome Statute, the body of law that, as many of you know, is integral to the International Criminal Court, that actus reus can include killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part of a particular group, imposing measures intended to prevent births within that group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We are seeing many of these forms, unfortunately, in a variety of contexts today. But as we all know, when it comes to genocide, it's the mens rea, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a racial, political, or cultural group that is the true uphill climb. For decades, prosecutors have been especially reluctant to prosecute destruction of peoples as genocide, both because of the challenges of tying the underlying acts to the four designated groups, national, ethnic, racial, or religious, but especially because of that challenge of showing intent. And this is where I think the potential of user-generated content becomes so interesting. The photos, the videos, the texts, the memes posted to social media and other places online can, in some ways, potentially help fill a bit of that gap. How might we show that intent to destroy a category of people using the tweets, the YouTube videos, the WeChats, often favored by those in power to communicate their narrative with the world? And how can we use tweets, TikTok, posts by victims and survivors, those closest to these sites of atrocity, to find the facts that allow us to know what has happened and what is happening? It's because of these legal challenges and those technical opportunities that we began taking in 2017 what we were learning in our investigations lab to begin building an international protocol on digital open source investigations. This is a document that would provide, hopefully, needed guidelines on how social media content and other online open source information could be reliably and systematically identified, preserved, analyzed, and presented to strengthen the potential for accountability in courts. In December 2020, the advanced copy of this new international protocol, which was co-authored by our Human Rights Center and by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was launched in concert with the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. This summer, that protocol will be officially released, this time in all of the languages of the United Nations. Although it was supported in its development by an academic institution, the document was ultimately born of a very pragmatic need, much like I think some of the strongest research being done by people at this conference today. After we launched the lab and as word got out about what we were trying to do, we had begun receiving calls from lawyers in conflict areas in diverse parts of the globe who were increasingly finding or being sent digital information related to atrocities, including genocide, but did not know how to preserve that content to any form of legal standard or analyze it in ways that could maximize its use for courts, or to be able to really understand how reliable it is, which of course has an importance beyond just the legal weight. It also extends to the quality of academic research and to other purposes. Unfortunately, we didn't know the answers to those questions either. So we began trying to see what else was out there, and with numerous partner organizations, we conducted a global review of case law. We brought on a colleague, Lindsay Freeman, to help manage the protocol's development and work with Eric Stover, our faculty director, a longtime war crimes investigator, and with me to put pen to page. And over a 3-year period, we conducted more than 150 consultations and hosted numerous workshops to try to work out stickier and newer areas of law and practice. Portions of the protocol were stress tested against our own investigations, as well as investigations at the International Criminal Court where Lindsay was embedded, ultimately allowing there to be an iterative relationship between what we would draft in the protocol, the investigations themselves, and then bringing what we learned about how helpful or effective that was back into the protocol's drafting. Ultimately, this also helped inform the development of standard operating procedures for the International Criminal Court around the use of digital open source information. While we hope that the protocol will ultimately provide a basis for strengthening the potential use of digital open source information for accountability and for research, the protocol merely provides a floor. The floor offers relevant terminology to standardize what people are talking about. Perhaps my biggest surprise when we started on that project was learning that people were using terms in very different ways. The common term for open source information at the time was a shorthand known as OSINT, which is an abbreviation for open source intelligence. But evidence isn't intelligence or vice versa, and information was a much broader category. So creating that terminology, or at least standardizing it, was something that took, at our first workshop we hosted an entire day and something we had allotted for an hour or two. It also spotlights a common set of concerns about which any online investigator should be aware, including the physical, digital, and psychological security risks that come with this. I think those can very easily be overlooked when one is first, exploring the potential of digital online information to strengthen research and fact-finding more generally. And we also began really trying to point out some of the legal considerations and the ethical considerations that arise. Open source investigations is a field of research that, while old, because publicly accessible information for intelligence and investigation stretches back thousands of years, it's also new in its digital format. The speed and scale of digital information take on new meaning in online spaces, often existing outside human capabilities for search and analysis, and ultimately requiring a collaboration between human and machine for effective functioning. A burning question I think many of us are facing now is how to best divide that labor to ensure the efficacy, efficiency, and ethics responsible work requires. Over the past decade, we have all seen how perpetrators have taken to social media to create climates of hate, climates that dehumanize their targets, creating a ripe and eventually rotten information environment in which genocidal rhetoric can flourish, mis and disinformation can spread, and generating on and offline violence that can seep into the physical world. In the past, in order to prove this intent to commit genocide, we've needed access to things like journals or other hard copy communications to document that intent. But today, of course, many of our diaries are digital. They're the tweet sent by a president in a moment of rage, and it's the propaganda promulgated by their followers online. What I hope we can begin to increasingly leverage are the tools of digital discovery and analysis to get at the hardest thing that the global legal and academic communities have to crack: establishing to a legal standard that intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group. I think on this front, the internet could potentially be a bit of a game changer, and we may start seeing more genocide prosecutions being brought. As with the infamous case of Rwandan genocide, when Tutsis were called cockroaches on radio and documentation of that incident provided critical evidence in court, today we have the postings of monks and the military to sites like Facebook. Today, people are leaking information deliberately or inadvertently across all of the digital spaces they travel. They may tweet their hatred. They may post a meme that dehumanizes. The Berkeley Protocol may help as a tool to support international and national investigators as they mine and build their cases to a forensic standard, but more is needed. Teams need standard operating procedures that outline the actual tools they'll use, what software and hardware, their internal workflows. They need training in recognizing hate speech, knowing where people are posting information with the support of what's called a digital landscape analysis, a systematic review of online spaces that tells researchers who, where, when, and how people are communicating online, and how that differs based on age and ethnicity, gender, and geography. Ultimately, while open source investigations are increasingly being recognized for their potential to provide critical lead information that gets us to other forms of evidence, as well as linkage and crime-based evidence, which is built into demonstrative evidence in digital aid to help people understand what had happened on the ground. Those investigations also have extreme limitations. One set of limitations is the many biases that come with working in a digital environment, both machine biases and human biases. And then there's, of course, access bias, with access to the internet differing by demographic. I want to focus for a moment on what that means for the gendered nature of documenting crimes, and especially genocide. My colleague Ulick Egan of Swansea University and I have been engaged in a multi-year study of how online open source investigations can be harnessed to strengthen investigation into sexual and gender-based violence, another cluster of crimes that have proven especially hard to investigate and to prosecute, and of course frequently overlap with the overarching crime of genocide. We interviewed traditional legal investigators, open source investigators who are working in digital spaces, and gender experts. They all had very different perspectives on the potential utility of digital information to help prove the foundations of these cases. Yet all of them collectively were skeptical about the ability of online information to help secure the facts needed for justice and reliability with gendered crimes. First, women have to deal with very differential access to digital technologies in many parts of the world. So to get the information up there and accessible can not only in some instances be especially dangerous, but can be impossible. They also often have to speak in very different ways and in very different places online than men. They may communicate more in images than words, according to at least a couple of the investigators with whom we spoke. They may use a different lexicon. Men also, of course, suffer and express themselves in gendered ways. For example, one of the things that we learned was that men will often not speak of themselves as having been raped, but as having been tortured. Investigators also often translate rape into torture when it comes to men, contributing to a very gendered schism in terms of what crimes we recognize and who we recognize as having suffered them. What I anticipate is that in the coming year, we're going to learn quite a lot, maybe even more than we might want, about the gendered aspects of genocide and how that can be documented. As these worlds begin to collide between genocide experts and digital experts, we'll have to learn how to effectively communicate and to share what we know between them. We have all seen the news spotted over the past year with allegations of genocide committed by the Chinese government against Uyghur populations. We conducted an investigation with the New York Times into the forced labor of Uyghur workers who are making PPE in the context of COVID for American markets. But labor wasn't the only thing that was forced. We also heard of forced sterilizations, as many of you have as well, of course, and the forced use of birth control, of family separations. We are currently collectively grappling with the relationship between the preventing of live births among disfavored, and I'm putting that in air quotes, populations, when birth control slides across this gray zone from the empowerment of women to their coercion and eventually to a crime. We are also growing increasingly and collectively aware of how coded communication can be and how creative people can become in their need to communicate. What Uluk and I have found is that when stigma is attached to a crime, as is often the case with issues of sex or reproduction, the lexicon quickly changes. Sometimes words disappear entirely and give way to visual images, to memes and to photographs, a graphic signaling among people in the know. And meanwhile, perpetrators are spending their own online propaganda trying to tell us how to interpret these signals. Nothing to see here. What this next generation of fact-finding requires to be successful is ultimately courage, creativity, and collaboration. There needs to be collaboration and creativity to bring us out of looking for things online merely through words, but knowing how to search with images and knowing how quickly our findings can change when we actually do search through pictures as opposed to terminology. But perhaps mostly what we need is that last part, collaboration, to bring together people with very different but equally important skill sets to find and process the necessary facts. People with the technical skills who know how to scrape large quantities of information from the internet. People with the analytical skills who know how to source, verify, analyze, and present digital evidence. People with legal skills who understand the elements of the crime of genocide and what's needed to meet those elements, and people with the language and cultural skills to recognize what is often staring at you or at all of us in plain sight online. How to read not only what is present, but is absent. As one investigator told Uluk and me, it's often the online absences and the silences that communicate the most. Who's not there? We need to learn how to read those negative spaces online without imparting our biases to them. And then there are the gender experts who understand the terminology that is being used among women, among men and children who are suffering and how they communicate their stigmatized suffering with the world, hoping someone out there sees it and can translate it, whether it's someone who speaks their language or someone who understands those codes, who knows where you can find the information online and where to look offline when you don't. And we need a lot of work directed at how to conduct online open source investigations ethically. Do we show a woman's death from every conceivable angle, from the handful of videos of that moment because we can? Do we publish the geo-coordinates of where the videographer likely captured the video that we found online because we've identified those coordinates, even if it means now perhaps he can be identified too? Too often, when we're grappling with decision-making in these investigations, we're faced with questions that the analog world and the training we received in that world has not yet fully equipped us to answer. And yet we also ignore that analog world to our peril, and potentially, and more importantly, the peril of others. We need to know what the law says about what we want to do. We need to know what our professional codes say about what we want to do. Too often, both of those have failed to keep up. And when those fail us, we need to know what the emerging code of OSINT ethics says about what we want to do. The code that requires us to consider the security and the dignity of all those who may be implicated by our research, as well as the quality and the accuracy of what we're doing. At the international level, digital investigations are in a relative infancy. However, given how fast people are increasingly pushing their communications into digital formats, we have no choice but to have this field grow up quickly, to maybe mature faster than we would have liked or hoped or would be ideal. But at bottom, what we need most is to get it right. We need to build the legitimacy of these tools, but also ensure that these tools are trustworthy and that they ultimately work to the benefit of all people without discrimination. We must be able to communicate so that not only we as investigators, but others who are consumers of that information we find have the confidence that we've got it right. And to do that, they need to know the right questions to ask, and we need to know how to answer them. Thank you. I'll go ahead and open it up to questions or to conversation. I look forward to speaking.
Thank you very much, Alexa, for this extraordinary presentation, and you're doing a great job in the center. It's amazing, and I guess it was really hard to summarize everything you do. So we have so far 3 or 4 questions. So I'm gonna go and read them. One of them is from Henry Teriol. Great remarks, Dr. Koenig. My question is about the link between having what a reasonable person would consider compelling evidence to that evidence actually affecting successful prosecutions. For instance, there are many cases in the US of videos of rape posted widely online, not simply not being enough for prosecution, but of victims not even able to get their videos of the rapes taken down from the online platforms. So do you worry about the increase in the amount and very hard to pronounce this, the verifiability of the evidence through online sources will be balanced by an increase in denial, or do you believe that the nature of internet-based evidence is such that it makes deniable more difficult?
There's so much embedded in that question, and it's a really great series of questions. I think the biggest fear that we saw when we were talking with gender investigators or more traditional investigators is that their concern was that as more and more digital information came into prosecutions of any crime generally, the judge's perspective of what's needed to prove the elements of a crime was going to be distorted. And that if you had incidents of rape, where at the international level, you're not supposed to require additional corroborating information to the same standard as perhaps for some other kinds of crimes, given how rarely those kinds of videos can be around, that ultimately the judge was going to start requiring that there be a video of that rape and then it have been verified. And so I think the big concern here was that as these seep into practice more generally, it was going to actually be harder to get these prosecutions. That said, I think one of the things that Luke and I also found, though, was that there's a few different things that we need to be thinking about with tricky issues like rape. One is that oftentimes there's an assumption that these videos don't exist online. Of course, sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do, and more often than we think. We were investigating one alleged crime for a human rights nonprofit law partner in an African country, and there was someone who had smuggled video footage of this particular crime out of the country, and I flew to a third country to pick up the hard drive and bring it back to our team. Our team was tasked with verifying that content, knowing how reliable was this? Was this some kind of deep fake or something that was staged? And so we did the analysis, and at the end of it, we asked the lawyers, do you want us to go and see if we can find more information about this crime on social media? And they said, you can do that if you want to, but you're not going to find anything. We went online and found so many videos of this type of crime in this particular facility, in this particular incidents on YouTube, that ultimately, when we brought those back to the lawyers, they said, oh my gosh, this may actually now not be a national crime. This might actually be a crime against humanity, because we may have the evidence here that this was widespread and that this was systematic. And I think one is challenging the assumptions that many of us are making. Another is when things are hiding in plain sight online, bringing that information in to help strengthen that. I do think There is the issue of some of these videos not being believed. We all know how cheap deep fakes are getting to make and how easily they can, I mean, for $35, you can download an app, of course, that is adding deep fake aspects to photographs you take or allowing you to make deep fakes yourself. And there is a bit of an arms race right now between many of the computer scientists that we're talking with and are working with to detect those deep fakes, and a lot of important work that's happening to try and embed some kind of technical indicia of reliability into videos as they're being made to help with the verification process. But I do think if you do the careful 3-step analysis that's recommended in the protocol, a lot of those concerns can quickly fall away. Where we've seen major media and researchers and legal investigators get tripped up is that they become overly biased without realizing it about an interpretation of a video. They're told it's Syria, so they believe it's Syria. They're told it's Libya, so they're analyzing it in a way really trying to prove to themselves that it is Libya instead of proving the null hypothesis. Can I prove that it's not Libya? The three-part process that we always recommend is first, look to see any technical information that's still attached to that video or photograph to help you understand its reliability. So is there metadata or EXIF data attached that may have a date and tell you where or when it was captured? Now, metadata can be manipulated, so you need to still verify the information itself, but it can be helpful lead information. The second is to verify the content of the video or photograph. If you're told this is Libya, is the kind of topography you're seeing in the background, the type of architecture, the clothing, the accents, is that all consistent with what you would expect to find in this time and place? And then the third is the source. And this is where media gets it wrong so often, is if they don't thoroughly assess the source for their reliability. Can they identify who it was that posted this to online places? Have they scrolled through their feed to see if this person claims to be posting this from Libya, that they weren't supposedly in Myanmar 3 months ago, that they're just kind of chasing the latest fad? Have they checked that handle across all social media sites to see that this person is consistent and potentially does have on the ground knowledge that's helpful? And if you do that, I think you do still get a really good sense of the reliability of this information. And even deep fakes, I think one of the things with deep fakes and faked information is that you can still, if a big incident happens, you expect to find more information about it online. There's usually not just one person posting about it. There may not be a lot, but you're going to find some other whispers about it. If you don't, I think that's a huge red flag. The issue of people not being able to get stuff taken down, so rape victims not being able to get their videos removed, that is something that we are actively working with and have been working with the social media platforms themselves to try and help them strengthen their human rights records and policies. Many of them have been hiring really credible and trustworthy human rights policy directors to try and help them on an internal perspective. The big challenge right now is that many of us who are in relatively privileged places have the ability to access those companies directly when something's put on our radar and to say, this really is a problem and we're hoping you'll pay attention to it. But many, of course, that there is an equal ability to do that around the globe geographically, in terms of class and access related issues. And so what we're helping them to try to think through is, how do you design policies that allow for us to be able to get the damaging information taken down quickly and the helpful information left up? The final thing that I would say is that it's also not a binary. And I think to think of it as a binary of take down, keep up, it can be a bit of a trap. One of the things that can be done, of course, is to algorithmically deprioritize certain kinds of content, like hate speech perpetrated against the Rohingya population. So instead of removing it from the platforms, making sure that the algorithms don't push it out to people so that people aren't exposed to that information, but that it's retained in places online where those investigators who have the URL or are told that it exists can go find it and get it. Or also working with them directly to create preservation mechanisms, because so often it's the state that is a perpetrator or state-related actors. Our old models of law enforcement, where it's really just police who can make these requests of platforms to get information preserved for later accountability, isn't sufficing. And I think one of the things that many of us are grappling with, and we just had a report come out on, is how do we create a system whereby certain human rights actors with legitimate legal authority can make these requests of platforms saying the government is perpetrating these things and putting these things online. We need it no longer accessible to the general public, but we need you to hold on to it because we're trying to build that political will to get law enforcement to come and make a formal request and get this into legal process, or to be able to do the research that's needed to build off of it. And sorry, that was such a long-winded answer, but there was a lot of information, I think, in that question.
It was all very interesting, Alexa. So I think we will be listening to you like for a couple more hours. So don't worry. Then we have 15 minutes. So we do have that's time to try to answer the comments and questions that come up. Melanie O'Brien is this amazing project. How do you deal with the chain of custody issues in the digital world in the protocol?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading the wrong one, I think. Do you mind repeating that really quickly?
Yeah, that was, you're reading the one of Armin, maybe.
Oh, Melody. Yes. Okay. So how do you deal with chain of custody issues in the digital world? That is the first question that we had to grapple with. So when we were getting calls from a number of lawyers on the ground in Iraq at one point, and we were still fairly new and running the investigations lab, asking specifically that question. And the answer is that really varies by jurisdiction, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it's changing fast. So whereas several years ago, even at the International Criminal Court, it used to be sufficient to do a screen grab or screen capture of what was on the page, to time and date stamp it, or to create a PDF about what you found online. Increasingly, what we're finding is that judges are saying, you know what, we're not finding that reliable enough. So we would like you to do something a little bit more robust. And what we're often finding is that you can use tools. There's one that we use called Hunchly, and we use it because we know the person who developed it, and we have a high degree of trust about how it operates. It holds everything on your desktop. It doesn't go to some cloud where other people may access it. But it allows you to pull down the entire tweet with all, or Facebook post with all the surrounding videos, photographs that have been posted in the comments. A lot of times, based on the principle of completeness, judges are going to want to see not just the video or the photograph, but they want to know the context in which it was posted, what people were saying about it, who was communicating. And for the investigator or researcher, that ends up being really valuable information as well. It's kind of like having the whole qualitative package to check against the quantitative information that you've got. It's also downloading any metadata or EXIF data automatically. There are some tools that will then allow you to capture it, and then it doesn't allow you to change it. What it does is it creates something, many of you are probably familiar with hashing, some of you may not be. To hash a video or a photograph, you can take a video or photograph that you found online and put it through software that creates an alphanumeric code that is specific and unique to that video or photograph. And on principle, actually on practice, if there's any manipulation done to that photograph or video, and you run it back through software, hashing software, the alphanumeric code will have changed. And that is one mechanism for, with digital information, knowing if something has been manipulated or changed. Of course, that only works from the point of capture on. And there are a lot of reasons why videos or photographs can potentially change without deliberate manipulation, like they degrade in some way, or something crashes and I think messes it up in some mechanism. But for the most part, it's fairly reliable. And I think it's what we're increasingly seeing as the standard, that when you capture something, you run it through the software, you create a hash code, and when that hash code is available to present in court if needed. Of course, the technical capacity of different courtrooms, different judges, what their expectations are. This is not an area that most judges have been trained in. They oftentimes may not know the questions to ask about the chain of custody of that digital information. And so I think there's a big pedagogical purpose and role to be had as well in helping not only investigators, but judges and courts and national authorities better understand how we can preserve chain of custody and therefore ultimately safeguard the reliability of the information we find.
Thank you, Alexa. Next question, that's from Armin. And it's about the limits of your work. So what happens, probably it happened to you that maybe governments would work with you or want to would ask for your help, how will you do that? No, hypothetically, what should you do when the FBI comes to you for help with the January 6th Capitol insurrection investigation? Or, I mean, what's the limit? You said you've been working with different groups, but I don't know if you mentioned governments. So.
Yeah, so I think we're very fortunate in that one of our safeguards is, as a human rights organization, is very much human rights principles. So, you know, of course, human rights were the framework was established to uphold the dignity of every individual in regards to state governments and to mitigate some of the overreach of government authorities with people. And so I think one analysis that we would always do in working with the government is, are the appropriate human rights safeguards and records in place, that we have a high degree of trust that these are going to be used in ways that concord with human rights principles. If they don't, then we're not going to work with them. That said, you know, governments are very important actors in the space. And I think if we were to rule out ever working with governments, we would never get legal justice, because it is the government authorities that have the ability to prosecute. Now, I think there are increasingly these intergovernmental mechanisms that are being created where the governments can be and operate almost as a check on each other. And hopefully no individual government has so much authority that they ultimately are able to manipulate or affect process. Many of you are probably familiar with the mechanisms that have been set up for Syria and Myanmar, and increasingly for other conflicts, to aggregate this digital information and other forms of evidence. So I have two puppies that have decided to wake up and run downstairs right now. So if you hear clanging in the background, that's my puppies. But to aggregate this information, when it comes to things like the FBI, in some ways, I was almost more concerned with the January 6th event of the people who refused to work with the FBI, and instead were posting to social media everything that they found from social media and ultimately magnifying it. So one of the big risks that I think many of us woke up to with the Boston bombing case or incident of 2013, that was an incident where there was a marathon in Boston in the United States, and there were bombs that were detonated, and there was some shaky, not great footage that was posted to the internet, and online citizen sleuths began to look at that to try and identify the identities of the perpetrators. Unfortunately, they got it wrong. And a young man by the name of Sunil Tripathi was ultimately targeted as the perpetrator. It turns out he was had already committed suicide potentially and was dead in a river somewhere. But it was very upsetting to his family, who had posted videos and photographs of him online with the hope that people would help find their missing loved one. And then investigators then ended up using that information to wrongfully point to him as the perpetrator. And you can only imagine how distressing that must have been. So I think we saw similar stuff with the January 6th event, where people were crowdsourcing information about who the perpetrators were, the people that you could see in the videos and photographs. Instead of forwarding those tips and suggestions to law enforcement for careful prosecution or investigation, they were posting their ideas about this online. And one thing that I do think we know from social science research is that confidence in our ability to visually compare information does not directly correlate with the accuracy of those visual comparisons. And there are whole bodies of forensic comparison science that have been discredited, or at least raised huge questions around, like fingerprint comparisons or tooth bite mark comparisons, where we know we're not very good at doing that as humans. So having a bunch of people just randomly doing that on the internet, potentially destroying lives, potentially endangering lives, you know, I think it's often a toss-up as to whether you work with that government or not.
Okay, thank you, Alexa. I'm going to be trying to wrap up a little bit, so that we have more time, maybe to touch upon everything. So I guess one of the questions is, to what extent digital media or technologies can help to prove intent, which is like probably the hardest part of the genocide. So I think there's a couple of comments with this in that direction. Then somebody else, also Mariana, is interested in your work, and she's mentioning actually the forensic architecture, who I think they do. I also know them; they do a very great job. I don't know if you work with them or you kind of collaborate. I imagine that yes. And then Rionan, she was with me in this panel this morning on technologies also. How are we able to navigate or distinguish between keyboard warriors or even sarcasm online to assess genuine intent to destroy? So that's, yeah, I guess I would focus on the intent thing.
Yes. Yeah. So maybe on the intent piece, I think a helpful exercise that I actually really, hopefully you would find this interesting too, but I really like almost putting up on a whiteboard, how are the ways in previous cases have we identified intent? What are the different tools that have been used? So everything from radio broadcast to people's private diaries to contracts or written orders that were provided across. And then almost in another column, putting what is available in digital spaces that can potentially establish intent. And I think, whereas it used to be very difficult to physically access some of those physical records, like the orders to commit certain kinds of crime or get the original radio broadcast, radio is a little bit different because it's broadly disseminated. The boots on the ground piece, as increasingly humanitarian protections have been degraded in a number of conflicts with a global pandemic and the inability to travel, heightened security concerns for all kinds of people. I do think the interesting thing is how much is available online because people put it out there. They're actually using the terminology that is very dehumanizing terminology. They're often, I think one of the most helpful things with digital open source information is actually just to create a chronology of, say, all the tweets or all the Facebook posts being put out by a potential perpetrator and timeline those and then timeline them across what was happening in that country and showing the correlations. Now, of course, that's not necessarily causation, but it can be really interesting for further investigation to research those similar shifts in what was happening on the ground and to probe those further. And I think for judges and for courtrooms, that can be incredibly helpful. So one of the things in the back of the protocol is a digital landscape assessment, also an investigation planning template. In some way, I think the annexes are the most helpful piece of the whole thing because they actually just do point to, here's some of the things you can be thinking about that maybe will enrich either your research or your investigation itself. And then maybe final thought on forensic architecture, C2 research is another one. I think it's really fascinating to see how architectural methodologies, sound wave methodologies are being brought into legal practice and ultimately being pulled together with the open source information. What I think still needs more exploration is looking at the biases that those kinds of platforms and digital aggregations of information can introduce into courtrooms. And I think we need a very healthy conversation about how to minimize some of the biasing aspects of bringing in what can seem very damning on the surface, but may ultimately be getting it wrong because we are human beings who bring our own perspectives to a lot of this work.
Great. Then I think we have time for one more question. Well, it's a very long team. You wrote very, very, very long comment. But I think the point is he's working on one of the other keys. So one of the problems is to prove intent, but the other one would be to prevent genocide. No, to what extent digital technology can identify these earlier steps of like, oh, we can, before the escalation. So, yeah.
Ultimately, I think that should be the end goal. How do we use the extraordinary scale of information being posted online, sentiment analysis, emotional analysis, to begin to see when there's a buildup or a ramping up, and to be able to detect when these genocides or other crimes may be on the verge of taking place. I think the tricky thing, though, is the political will part of it, because often in the past we've known, I think there's a lot of signaling that happens that we may not know to a scientific certainty, but certainly due to a human one, that something is happening that's going to lead to something awful. And it's often the reluctance of governments to step in that I think has been the true barrier. So in some ways, while I do think there's so much technical potential for us to be more preventative, and I think it really will be exciting to see over the next few years how we're able to aggregate and analyze these large data sets to find these signals in the noise. It's going to continue to be the qualitative slog of convincing governments to act that are actually going to be necessary to intervene and getting that coordinated.
Definitely, I agree with you. No, sometimes it's not so much that we don't have the information, like for example, the genocide in Darfur or even in Myanmar, but sometimes we're missing this reaction of doing something. Well, thank you very much, Alexa. That has been very, very thrilling and exciting conversation, and it was a pleasure to have you here with us. We invite you to join other sessions that we're having in the afternoon and during the week. And thank you very much, and hope to have you next time also. So bye-bye.
Thank you for having me, and look forward to seeing all the other presentations. Have Have a great night.